To continue with our discussion of politics during the Renaissance, the Medici family were one, if not the foremost family in Florence, and they are very much part of the oligarchy. That I said that although Florence was a republic, it was also an oligarchy, and this family were at its centre. To begin with, it didn't look like they were going to be. The Medici family didn't migrate to Florence until the 13th century, but its first prominent member was Giovanni de' Bici de' Medici. And he was a banker who accumulated a vast fortune. He was actually said to be the wealthiest man in Italy, which kind of also means in the whole of Western Europe as well. In 1434, Giovanni's son, Cosimo de' Medici, inherited his father's fortune, and he became the unofficial first citizen of Florence. So this tallies with when historians mark the beginning of Medici rule in Florence and a solid move to oligarchy at this time. Indeed, they're often interpreted as being the triumph of private interest over public interest. Cosimo was succeeded by his own son, Piero, who was nicknamed the Gaudi, and he had two sons as well. One of them was called Lorenzo. He's known as Il Magnifico, or the Magnificent. His younger son had an illegitimate son who the family were able to make pope. So the Medicis were well connected on many, many levels. So our next slide is going to illustrate exactly what I mean about how well the Medicis are well connected across Europe. You do not need to study this family tree. It's just to show how many there are and how there's actually not just one but two popes among their numbers. And this, by the way, as it says, is only important Medici. So you can see Giovanni right at the top left, and then his son, who I said became, really got the Medici going. And then if you can continue down on the left-hand side, you can see there's popes. So Pope Leo X and Clement VI were both related. Well, they were both a part of the Medici family. And you can see other countries' flags there, which I'm going to explain very shortly. But next, we've just looked at Italy and looked at Italy as a case study. Let's have a look at France as a case study. And it's a good example of new monarchy. As I said in the previous video, wink, wink, hint, hint, good idea to study up on this. What is a new monarchy then? Well, it's a new type of monarch or king or queen that is very personal, but also very institutionalized. This is a tendency among the monarch towards absolutism, absolute monarchy. We're not at the point where they are absolutist monarchs, but they are really trying hard to be and putting a lot of processes in place that's ultimately in a few hundred years going to lead to that point. What they're trying to do is consolidate and centralize their powers by replacing competing powers, particularly the church, the nobility, with them. They are the royal centralized power supported by this bureaucracy. So the kind of things they did to achieve this include implementing new legal systems, particularly return to Roman law. They reform and expand their tax base to make sure they've got plenty of money to spend. That includes centralizing the revenue collection, the revenue system. They do things like promote national feelings, they expand their territory, and they created national armies. So lots of things to make it more centralized and focused on this one leader. So the new monarch, also called the Renaissance monarch or Renaissance prince, he is economic and military might. He's very different from the medieval king. He's also very different from the government of the Italian city-states. This change took place mainly in the 16th century, and it is best associated with three kingdoms: France, England, and Spain. But we're going to have a look at France. So the centralized monarchy in France evolved in different stages, and it reaches its height with Louis XIV in the 18th century, and building up to the French Revolution. Where it really gets going is with the reign of Louis XI, and he is often viewed as being the beginning of Renaissance politics in France. He was nicknamed the Spider King, and that was because he was a real Machiavellian schemer. He really was a Machiavellian ideal. Louis played competing sides off against each other. He allied himself with the new middle class, the rising bourgeoisie. The middle class, as we briefly touched on during the last 2 weeks, are a new group of people emerging after the Black Death and the trials of the 14th century, because they've got more spending power than they ever had before, and they're more urban. Because he allied himself with the middle class and he reformed the tax system, it meant that he had more money to spend on the things that mattered to him. He created a royal bureaucracy, an efficient tax system. This means that his public revenue increased 300% in the 14-year period between 1470 and 1484. Also happening at this time, the end of the 100 Years' War, which we looked at last week. Now, this in short term was economic devastation, but it kind of meant that everything was so ruined he could kind of begin again from scratch. He also managed to defeat Burgundy. Remember, Burgundy was the yellow bit that kept allying itself with England because it wanted to unify the two yellow bits. Well, they defeat Burgundy as a regional power, and this means that France, with this, is kind of the shape that we know France today. So Louis got it underway, but it really matured under Francis I, who reigned from 1515 to 1547. He built upon this system that he had inherited. And indeed, inheritance is key here. These kings, these new monarchs, create a centralized bureaucracy that allows for politics to rise above the individual personalities and whims of kings, and thus ensures stability over long periods of time. Francis I did build upon what his predecessors had done, but he also patronised the writers, artists, scholars of the Renaissance. For example, his court was home to Leonardo da Vinci for a time. We have a close link between the French Renaissance court and the centre of the Renaissance in Florence, Italy. And this came when Francis married his son, Henry, to one of the Medici. Catherine de' Medici. She ultimately became Queen of France. She was born in Florence. She was the daughter of Lorenzo de' Medici, the Duke of Urbino, and her mother was a French woman called Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne. She was orphaned at an early age, and in October 1533, she married the future Henri II of France. And this was part of an arrangement between Pope Clement and King Francis I to ally themselves. Now, she wasn't meant to be Queen of France. Henry was a younger son, but it was still a pretty big deal at the time because she wasn't royalty. Even today, for royals to marry outside of other royals or lords is pretty unusual. Look at what happened to Meghan Markle and Kate Middleton in the UK. So Catherine de' Medici was very much looked down upon by the French nobles, even though her mother came from a very illustrious family. She has been a victim of historiography, that is the history of history writing. She's tended to have been depicted, as many powerful women were, as very negative. She's depicted as being a spendthrift. People said she squandered royal money on patronising the arts and feasts and dances. She was a real Renaissance woman. She loved art, poetry, music. She also loved building projects. She made court life in France very strictly ordered based on what she experienced in Florence. And the organisation of the court was able to also contribute to the stability of the country. The French courtiers sneered at her, though, but despite that, when Henry was away, he often put her in charge of running things, so she was a very capable political leader. She was, when she acted as regent, that's our term for when the king is away and he appoints someone in his place. Again, victim of people writing about her afterwards who don't like powerful women. She was, as many of these women are, accused of being using her sexual wiles to get what she wanted. We're going to meet her again next week when we talk about the Reformation, actually. But she had a huge role to play in spreading Renaissance artistic values to France because of her background in Florence. Now, I already mentioned the court, and this is actually part of French government. The king, of course, is at the top in French government, and he is supported by the bureaucracy. Up at the top of the bureaucracy, there's the King's Council. And these are a small group of men, things like princes, major officers, but it was a very flexible group. It wasn't like they were elected or appointed or anything like that. The king could appoint it as he wanted, and so it was a changeable group. He could invite different experts in depending on what advice he needed at the time. So we might have invited churchmen or military men depending on what the problems were. So it was a kind of fluctuating group of people between maybe 20 and 30 in the King's Council. A smaller group of 5 or 6 advised the king every morning, and this means that the power in France is in the hands of a few, and access was because of proximity to the king. A big part of the bureaucracy were the secretaries. The secretaries were not from noble or aristocratic backgrounds. They were ministers. They were appointed to this. They tended to come from the bourgeoisie, and this meant that it was more secure for the king, that these were people who owed their positions to him and did not come from backgrounds where they maybe had self-interest at heart rather than the king's interest. There were 3 great officers within the government: the constable, the admiral, and the chancellor. The most important of these was the chancellor. From the legal perspective, there was the Parlement de Paris, and that sounds like it's a parliament and therefore legislative, but actually it was a judicial body. It dispensed royal justice, although it's called of Paris. It controlled over half of the country. So he was also using laws to bring the whole of the country into line. But within this is the French Renaissance court. It was vastly influenced by the Renaissance. It was formally organised. They already modelled it on Italy, and then Catherine de' Medici really made it on the Italian lines. This is part of a bigger trend under these authoritarian rulers, because the court could help develop a cult of monarchy and cement the new style of European monarch leadership. The court was movable. It was the sort of band of hangers-on attached to the monarch, and they moved around to make sure that it was as visible as possible. It was also massive. We reckon it could have had up to 18,000 people on it. So all these people gathered close to the king and queen and travelling around on the move. Well, it's going to attract attention, and attention is what they wanted. There was also a military force. It also acted as protection for the king. And it was very, very symbolic, particularly when, if they were going to have a reception for an ambassador or ceremonies. You might have had nobles, dukes, peers, all sorts of hangers-on in the court. Why would they do this? Well, bring all the people together under one small place, and it allows the king to keep a close eye on what's going on. Because they depend on the king physically, it means the king can control them a lot better. This means there's no spontaneous or natural behaviour at court. Instead, it's kind of like poker face. You don't want to let slip what you're really thinking when you're living with 18,000 other people in a cramped space. Courtly literature became really popular at this time. There are actually books like Castiglione's Book of the Courtier that is like a how-to guide for how to behave at court. It's emphasising how to be cultured over giving into your own nature. The royal progresses, as this court moves around, is planned in minute detail so that the people of France could see the monarch in the flesh and participate themselves in the cult of monarchy. So this was particularly done when support was low, so that people would be like, oh my God, look at all the pomp and splendour, and be really impressed. It's part of the king showing how he controls the whole land. Patronising the arts is also a big part of it. Henry had a group of artists associated with him called the Pleiadae, and they were a group of 7 poets. So it's also a place where artists could work and the intelligentsia practiced. The court and the government were very intertwined. The King's Council was held in the King's presence at court, usually each morning and in the afternoon as well. It would tend to be very masculine, despite this picture, which shows a party at a ball at the court. The men were expected to pitch up at court, and then they would therefore leave their wives at home to run their estates. But women were there to cement power as well. One of the people who's written most on the French Renaissance court is a guy called Robert Knecht, and he says, and here's a quote, "It was then a motley crowd of people who sometimes stayed put, but were more often moving across the kingdom and largely unaware of etiquette. The king was surprisingly accessible to his subjects. A royal edict of 1530 showed how easy it was for anyone to enter his lodging. Because of the great flow of people who each day come into our lodging when we are there, several thefts have taken place of ornaments from our chapel, of silver plate, and of clothes belonging to us and to others by people who, by virtue of being decently dressed, are allowed to enter everywhere without being observed, and likewise by others who, by claiming acquaintance with some members of our suite, penetrate everywhere." So this tells us that this monarch was also accessible. This was part of his cult of monarchy, that he was to seem like a real person as well as being an untouchable person. A lot of people will have come to court because they had business there, whether it was with the king or with other nobles who were there. They would also have had a lot of guests, like foreign diplomats that they could show off, and they would have had a lot of hangers-on of their own as well. Merchants and artisans would pitch up looking for favours for their business or for the town that they came from. So it's a very movable group of people, and historians, although it's up to 18,000, we try to estimate how many people it was, you know, on average, probably somewhere between 15,000 and 8,000 people. And it would have been larger in times of peace than at war, because at war, they're all out fighting for the king. But it was constantly changing, bustling people going to and fro. I'm going to close this video now. The next part is a question about the court, and then we're going to move on to the cultural aspects of the Renaissance.